So, folks, a huge welcome to everybody. This is the last in our player education webinars this year, and we are going to be discussing the topic of managing training loads across sports this evening. So, my name is Ailish Ward. I am the head of player development with the LGFA, and I'm also joined by Sarah Murphy, who is the games development officer for Connacht. So, great to have Sarah on the call as well, and Sarah will be popping in and out. But she'll also be facilitating the chat and any questions that kind of come in through that this evening. All right. So, as I said, in terms of what we're going to cover here tonight, obviously the focus is around training load and how we can manage that. So, firstly, we're going to look at actually what is this, what is training load, some of the factors that can potentially contribute to that. And then we're going to look at two main concepts in terms of the session. So we're going to look at progressive overload, and then we're also going to look at periodization. Finally, then we're going to look at actually how can we measure training load, and we'll give you some, I suppose, practical tips in order to do that. And then we'll actually look at, right, well, what does that mean? How can we manage that? If I'm a player, equally, if I'm a coach, how can I manage the training load across a team of individuals? But equally, if I'm a player playing multiple sports, how can I manage my own training load to make sure that I'm in the best shape possible in order to play? So, in terms of what is training load is generally described as the cumulative amount of exercise that you're doing. Okay, it's quite a simple definition, but this is usually measured over the course of a week. All right, and in terms of the two main measurements that can contribute to the above, they're quite simple. One is the duration of the training, and then the other is the intensity of the training. So, firstly, how long are we training for? How many times a week are we training? But then, secondly, actually, how tough is that training, both physically on the body, but then also potentially from an external perspective as well. And for anybody that maybe, I'm aware that some people might have seen our previous webinar, which was done in January, which was around organising myself as a player for the season ahead, which was led by Niamh McLaughlin from Donegal. And this graphic is something that came up within this. So this is a periodization strategy for intercounty players. And I don't want you, there's obviously lots of detail on the screen there, but I don't want you to focus on everything. I really want to draw your attention to, I suppose, the first few lines in terms of that and in terms of the competition focus. So you can see there up the top, we have a number of things there. We have off-season, pre-season, National League and All-Ireland Series. But under that then we have the season phase, okay? And the season phase, we have our general preparation phase. We then have the specific preparation phase, and then we have the competitive phase, okay? And they're kind of the three main phases of the season. So if we think about this from a training load perspective, the general preparation phase within this area, what you'll generally be looking to do is build up your foundation for the season ahead. Okay, so if you think about it from an endurance perspective, you might be doing longer running, you might be doing things that are of a higher duration but a lower intensity. Equally, you might be in the gym a little bit more, and you might be on the field getting reused to, I suppose, some of those fundamentals from a technical aspect. Okay, so in terms of the training load at this stage of the season, that could actually be, as I say, it's a lower intensity, but it might be higher duration. All right. And because of the higher duration, you might find that there's more fatigue at this stage of the season. And equally, that can generally be because the body's just coming off a break at the end of the previous season as well. If we look at then the specific preparation phase, what we'll find is that this tends to kind of flip that. So we'll tend to find that actually the duration might start to lower a little bit, but actually the intensity will start to ramp up. And with that, that's as we start to prepare to go into maybe match stages, as we start to progress from maybe the league stage and starting to go towards championship. And then as you get to the competitive phase of the season, what we'll find is actually the training load might reduce because we tend to be focusing more on performance. We tend to be focusing more on games in general. So in terms of the actual training itself, the training load might reduce dramatically because at this stage of the season, what we're trying to find is we're trying to actually just preserve the levels that we have. We're trying to get into, I suppose, that maintenance stage. So this graphic, as I say, there's a lot of detail on it. We don't need all of the detail here in terms of tonight, but it's just to give us an idea of maybe the differentiation between different stages of the season. And equally, it's really important, when we're considering training loads, our players aren't just players, okay? We're also people as well, whether you're a player yourself or whether you're a coach working with players, okay? So there's this kind of concept of the 24-hour athlete. And I suppose within this, if you're considering that actually if you're a player that was training every single night, okay, you're actually still only going to be training for 1 or 2 hours of your day, okay? So equally, you'll have another 22, 23 hours. And there's all these contributing factors that can, I suppose, whilst they don't directly impact the training load, what they can do is potentially add more stress to the training load, or they can also mitigate some of those. So if we think about these, think about things such as recovery, stretching, foam rolling, mobilization. Think about nutrition, how we fuel ourselves for training, our sleep, how much sleep or how little sleep we get, hydration, rehydration. We also have things such as injury, sickness, they can all impact. And I suppose finally the other thing is actually all the other stuff that tends to be going on in our lives. So as a player, maybe if we're at youth level, what's going on in school, what's going on with my friends. Equally, as we get older, we go into work, maybe university, other relationships can also impact. So, Sarah, I know before we started the webinar, we were talking a little bit around this, and I think you were talking around maybe youth players specifically here.
Yeah, so I think like particularly with teenage players, they can manage quite a high training load in terms of the volume of training. So you can often have like teenage players would, be training a couple of times a week. They might be training with different sports, with different teams. When they're playing in school, they could be playing 2 or 3 sports in school and then training in the evening and stuff. And sometimes when we look at their ability to manage this volume of training, some weeks they might be absolutely fine, and then some weeks they're going, "Oh my goodness, no, I'm just wrecked. I can't." Or this was so much harder than it was last week. Why can't I manage it? And that's when we can look at things like their sleep and their hydration, what they're eating. Maybe they came straight from school and they didn't have dinner. And like that can be a reason why training is so much harder this week than it was last week. It's not that training, the actual session might be any harder. It's just, it's harder for them because of how they prepared or their lack of preparation for it. And I think that can be a really important part, particularly with the teenage players, that they're hitting those kind of key things like their hydration and their sleep and nutrition, just to make sure that they're able to manage a higher volume of training if it's something they kind of want to do. And even if they haven't a high training, having a big volume of sessions or training, it means that they're able to have more energy and they're able to better manage just the session that they are doing. So it's an important part of managing training load as well.
Perfect. Thank you. So we're just going to move on, guys, to this concept then of progressive overload. So this is, I suppose, in some ways it's quite a technical term, but hopefully we'll simplify it a little bit. So progressive overload is generally seen as a principle that's used in strength training or cardiovascular endurance exercise training plans. But equally, this is something that can be applied to any training, whether it's in Gaelic football, whether it's in rugby, soccer. It doesn't necessarily matter what the actual type of training is, that the principle essentially is still the same. So what this involves is gradually and systematically increasing the difficulty of your workouts or increasing the difficulty of your training, okay, to support continual progress in terms of our strength, our power, our speed, but also our fitness levels, okay? And just to kind of bring that down to layman's terms, so what that actually means for us as players or coaches, what we're really looking for here is that we want training to be built up gradually, okay? We want it to be built up in slow increases. And I've written here, this concept of the 10% rule. So generally what we don't want to see is an increase of over 10% on a week-on-week basis in terms of our training load, okay? So if we think about the intensity of our exercise, or equally if we think about the frequency or the duration of that exercise, across all those three concepts, we wouldn't want to see an increase of over 10% on a week-on-week basis. Equally, it's really important with this, we can't just infinitely increase exercise or increase our training load by 10% week on week, okay? So we couldn't start in January and keep increasing our training load by 10% on a weekly basis. until September. Okay, we need to build in proper consolidation or compensation periods. Okay, and with that, as a player, basically, or as a coach, what that basically means is we want to build in regular periods that we're actually promoting rest and recovery, and a lighter training load, which allows us to actually get the benefits of the training that we're doing. So there's an example here that will bring it to life a little bit. And so this example isn't from a Gaelic perspective, because that can be quite nearly difficult to quantify in some aspects. But what this is from, so this is from a marathon training plan. So just to explain this, so on week 1, and you can see up the top here, it says week 1, and then underneath it says week 9. So this individual, this is actually their third block of training. So before they've got to this stage, they haven't just started their week 1. They didn't go out and they started with a 24K long run. I think on their week 1, their longest run would have been 8K. Okay, so this has been something that's been built up over a period of time. But what you can see on week 1, we have 3 sessions generally per week. We have an easy run, we have a speed session, and then we have a longer run at the weekend. Okay, our total volume in week 1 is 39 kilometers, and week 2 it's 42 kilometers, and week 3 it's just over 47 kilometers. But then on week 4, and this is the probably the most important week nearly of the cycle, that drops down to 26 kilometers. Okay, so what we have is from week 1 to week 2, we have a 7.7 increase, percentage increase in terms of the training load. Week 2 to week 3, this is actually probably a little bit above what's recommended. It's around 11.4. But again, that's probably because this individual is so far into their training plan. And then on week 3 to week 4, we see a 45% reduction in terms of that training load. And that's kind of going back again to that concept of compensation and consolidation. Okay, so what we're looking for is deliberately to increase the volume or the intensity and regular occurrence to push beyond our current capacity. Okay, and the reason that those increments are built in over time is that by building in the increments, that's what makes us a little bit fitter, that's what prepares us a little bit more, but equally it allows us to kind of manage the risk of injury within that. Okay, so we can't as individuals go from, say, coming back the first day of pre-season being able to run 3K, and then the next week we say, right, we're going for a 10K run. That's not feasible. Okay, we want to build that up over time. And by actually, I suppose, managing this increase and utilizing this principle of progressive overload, if we can keep the percentage increase under 15%. Okay, if it's under 15%, there's probably a 10% chance of injury. But once we go over 15%, that chance of that chance of injury actually increases up to 50%. Okay, so if you imagine, if we go from, as I say, running 5K one week and we do a 20% increase to the next week, where we decide actually, or 40% increase, and we decide, right, I'm going to increase that by 2K straight away, I'm going up to 7K, you're 50% more likely to get injured, as opposed to if you increased it from 5K to 5.5K. Okay, so we want to avoid huge jumps, huge spikes in the training cycle. Sarah, just before, I suppose I'll actually run through this side first, and then this kind of concept is brought to life a little bit here, and this is just a bit of a visual. So as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, we're spreading out the load, but we're also building in time for recovery, which means there are times that we get lowered capacity, which would have been week 4 in the first graphic that I shown. But then actually what that allows us to do is we kind of get the super compensation phase then, where this is where we actually get the gains. Then you have the lower capacity again, but actually then as we increase the training load, again, in a managed way over the course of a season, we have increased capacity and health. Okay, but if we kind of build these back to back to back and don't have that compensation time, what we see is then we have, we're probably not as fit, we're not as healthy, and we're probably a lot more likely to get injured. So Sarah, just on that kind of concept of progressive overload, is there anything that you want to add there?
Yeah, I think it just you've just kind of mentioned there the highlighted importance of that like rest period that we actually get to deload to be able to build from there again. And I think from a practical point of view, especially if we're if we're coaching, sometimes it can be, or even as players, sometimes we think, oh, I can't miss this training session, because I've got a game at the weekend and I need to be training. But like sometimes you're better off taking a step back, not taking that session, and be ready to go again at the to either play that game or to do a light session to be able to go again. Sometimes when we're training a lot, we think we have to keep it up, and you can kind of see clearly from the graphic that that's not always the case, that sometimes we're just better to take a step back, take a rest, and to take a rest day and go again. And it can be good to get into that habit as well. And obviously we'll chat a bit more about kind of over a season how that looks, but even from like a week to week point of view, it can be good to make sure to factor that in, that we're not just training every day and that we're kind of building all the time, just that we have that period.
Brilliant. And I suppose speaking of that, kind of leads us nicely onto the next section, okay, which is talking around periodization. So I suppose this is kind of taking this concept of progressive overload, but then putting it into practice in some ways over the course of the season. So periodization is actually just, I suppose, taking that concept of building up specific blocks of training, and also building in time for rest. So basically taking, a mix of higher and lower resistance training at specific points of the year in order to maximize our performance. And this gives us multiple benefits. It will generally make us fitter, faster, better players, stronger. It will also allow us to stay injury free. And, if you think about this in a really simple concept, we always talk around as players or as coaches wanting to peak at the right time. Okay. And periodization is essentially allowing us to peak at the right time. So if you imagine that, for most, whether say for example, any sort of club championship will generally probably be happening now around August, September, everybody's going to be at the same stage, or should be at the same stage now at the start of the season. So if you're flying with sprint work at this point of the year, it would be very difficult to maintain that level of high intensity training over a long period of time. But actually, if you build that in appropriately through periodization, that'll allow us to kind of negate overtraining, and it'll allow us to progress our performance, but it'll also allow us to optimize our performance. And when we talk about optimizing performance, it's not saying that, right, we're going to go out and we're going to have a brilliant game just because we build in periodization. That's not what it's about. But actually, it means that we put ourselves in the best place to play as well as we can and get out on the pitch. So there can generally be 3 cycles of periodization, and the first of these is the macro cycle. And as a player, you kind of want this will generally be the course of your season. Okay. So you want to think about your bigger picture, and you want to think within this around peaking for performance. And that kind of goes back to those kind of 3 phases that I would have talked about earlier around general prep, specific prep, and then the competitive stage. Your mesocycle then will generally be your 4 to 6 week blocks. So if you think about the marathon training plan, that would have been one mesocycle within that, and that would have involved 1 deload week per block for consolidation of training. And then our microcycles, so these are short cycles. These will tend to be, say for example, for me as a player, actually, what am I doing this week in terms of my training? And what you want to be happening is that your microcycle will be feeding into the aims of your mesocycle, and then your mesocycle will feed into the aims of your macro. Okay, so with your microcycles, the intensity, the duration, these can differ from training to training. Okay. Equally with your mesocycle, from one mesocycle to the other, the intensity and duration will be different within that. And this goes back again to this graphic that we showed at the start. So it just kind of brings us to life a little bit more in terms of some of the concepts that I suppose that we would look around. Sarah, is there anything around periodization there that you want to come in with, or anything different?
No, I kind of think you've touched on a lot of there. I think from like a macro cycle point of view, like from that kind of bigger cycle, that can depend on our sport, what time period we use to put it for that cycle. So like for a Gaelic football player, it would be like our football season, kind of nearly like almost a year long. And then if we were talking about an Olympic athlete, they would have to factor in like a 4-year macro cycle, because that would be what they're leading towards. So what they're
Mm.
doing 1 year would have to lead up towards that. So I think that's just varies across the sports, but you kind of have, we'll look now at what it is specifically for like a ladies Gaelic football player, but just that it kind of varies.
Yeah, and I think probably one of the challenges, as a player or equally as coaches of players that are maybe playing multiple sports, what you might happen is that, or have is quite common, is that you're maybe in different stages of the competition focus or different stages of periodization across the sports, or even if we think across teams. So actually, the work that, say, for example, an inter-county player might be doing at the moment, they will be at a different stage of their season compared to their club counterparts. So the club counterparts at the moment will probably be doing, say, more of that kind of pre-season, that higher duration, um, longer duration, lower intensity work. The flip will probably be true for the inter-county player, but when the inter-county player goes back to club, they'll still just be maintaining probably that transition phase or that kind of competitive phase. Okay. So we're not saying, if somebody is playing across multiple teams, what you'll need to do is kind of look at, actually it's probably the season that's probably further ahead is probably where that player will be at. And you'll just be kind of looking then to maintain. So for example, if it was an intercounty player, you wouldn't be expecting them to be in a club scenario now and doing all the same fitness work because they already have that done. Equally, if it's a girl that's maybe your player, you're playing two sports, and you have a soccer preseason that started in January, you have a Gaelic preseason that starts now in March. You probably have 2 months of the work already done. So you're probably not needing to do the same duration, the same intensity, or the same amount of endurance work that maybe your counterparts in a Gaelic team might be doing. So how can we actually measure this? So I suppose training load is actually measured by the total, I suppose, amount, or the total impact of your training across all disciplines of sports, and we generally do that over the last 7 days. Okay, so the volume of that can be measured. We've mentioned these two phrases lots already: duration and intensity. And we generally say this can be broken down into two main subcategories. So if we look around external training load, these are things that maybe as an athlete, you actually probably sometimes you will have control over these, but actually a lot of the time maybe your coach will have control over these. Um, so we think around the physical stress that's applied to your body, and these are things that are quite easily externally measured. So we think distance, we think pace, we think other performance measurements such as the amount we lift or how far we jump, whatever that might be. The internal training load, then that is specifically how my body reacts to the physical stress that we're under. And as Sarah would have mentioned earlier when we talked around that teenage player example, you know, how my body reacts to training. I could essentially do the same training maybe on a Tuesday and on a Thursday. And because of all the external factors that are going on, I might have had a really lovely day at work. And on Tuesday, I might have fueled correctly, got 8 hours sleep the night before. Whereas maybe on the Thursday, got 5 hours sleep and had a stressful day at work. Didn't miss lunch because I had a work meeting. So actually, the impact of the training could have a different load on my body then. And in terms of how the physical stress is measured, this will be done through a number of factors. So it can be things such as your heart rate, how that varies. It can be your resting heart rate. It can also be the amount of oxygen that is getting around your blood system. And I suppose what we're looking for, I suppose the reason that SpO2 is something that's it can be seen as a bit of a unit of measurement is if we're not getting oxygen around our blood system, that's kind of what generally tends to cause the buildup of lactate then, which causes cramp, spasm. And look, we all know whenever we're training, that's never really a good sign. So we know that the body is clearly under some physical stress there. And then just to break that down a little bit further, so acute training load, this is something that is probably measured over the course of a week, and then your chronic load is something that's the average measurement over 4 weeks. And again, kind of going back to this progressive overload, it's a similar type of rule, but this is crucial to avoid any dramatic spikes and ebbs of our training load across time, as either as increasing either of these can then affect, I suppose, our risk of injury. And if we think about this in terms of a practical example, so I suppose like if we dive straight back into training, so say if it's maybe first week of preseason, equally if I've gone out and I've got an injury, I've been out for 3 weeks, and then I go back into the same session straight away as my club teammates, I'm going to be at a much higher risk of injury. Equally, I might have just missed 2 weeks of training because I've had stuff going on with work. I might have been on holiday, whatever that might be. It can be really tempting. And Sarah mentioned this to catch up. You know, we're always dying to get back into the fold, but actually, probably just building in a little bit of time there to get us back up to speed will probably mean that we'll actually be back on the pitch for probably quicker in the long run, and we'll actually probably stay on the pitch longer. And in terms of a bit of a calculation for this, so what you want to get is, I suppose, the acute to chronic workload ratio, okay? And this is where we take the training that we've done that week and then divide it by the average of the training that we've done over the previous 4 weeks, okay? And if we can get this ratio in the space of 0.8 to 1.3, this is generally what is termed to be the sweet spot, okay? Because this will be the spot that we're not moving backwards, we're moving forwards, but equally we're not putting ourselves at risk of injury, okay? And it's really important to say that, you know, I suppose that, look, we all have off days as well. You know, we can have bad trainings now and again, and progress isn't just going to be linear, you know, just because we work things out in terms of this kind of calculation. Um, so numbers and metrics aren't everything, you know, and we will talk about these because they give us, I suppose, a base to work off, but actually how we feel about things, and we'll go into that in a little moment, and how our body we feel as players, and how maybe, you know, if you're a coach, how your players feel is really important to understand, to actually understand what the impact of the training load is, okay? So just a bit of an example here. So if we look at week 1, 2, 3, and 4, so we've this is just a really kind of simple example. I have a Gaelic one then in a second, but over the course of that week, okay, those weeks, we have 20K ran. Okay, so in order to work out what our chronic workload is, we divide that by 4, okay, which creates which is basically equal to 5 kilometers. Okay, so what we do then, in order to work out the training load for that week, we divide the overall weekly total, which in this case for week 4 is 6, by the average over the previous 4 weeks, which is 5, and that gives us a ratio of 1.2 or 120%. Okay, which, as we know from the previous slide, that kind of comes into that nice band of that 0.8 to 1.3 ratio, which is the sweet spot. So so what we're seeing there is that that will probably lead to an increase in fitness, but equally that the athlete is not at risk of injury or at less of a risk of injury. So equally that the training load is properly managed. And I think I mentioned this already. It's not just about numbers. And I think this is probably, if you don't take anything else from the presentation, I think this is probably one of the most important parts. Is it's brilliant to understand, you know, the duration of the training, like how long we're training, how many days a week we're training, how far we've ran. That is all brilliant. But if we were to take, for example, myself and Sarah, so myself and Sarah could do the exact same training plan. Now for this week, we could play in the same club team, we could be best friends. So we go out, we complete the same 3 club sessions per week. We go and do 1 extra running session per week and maybe 1 gym session a week. And we do the exact same exercise, lift the exact same, run the exact same distance. But actually, my perceived rate or my rate of perceived exertion might be completely different to Sarah's. Okay, so Sarah could find that actually she's found the club training really, really easy that week. She said, yeah, do you know what? It wasn't too bad. It's coming in around maybe a 4. There was a bit of work involved, but actually there was lots of breaks. You know, she fueled up correctly for the week and she was ready to go. Whereas actually I might have had other stuff going on. So I might have found one of the training sessions, actually, do you know what? That's been really, really difficult for me individually. I found that maybe around a 7 or an 8, and the other two maybe around a 5 or a 6. And then, you know, the other two sessions, maybe the running and the gym were the same for each of us. But what you'll find then is actually that the training load will be different for the two of us as a result of this rate of perceived exertion. And this is something like this is really, really simple. You know, it's literally saying actually from a scale of 0 to 10. So 0 would essentially be you're sitting on your couch. You're probably actually sleeping. At 0 is probably what I would say. Like number 1 would be that you're sitting on your couch. Number 10 then is, you know, if you figure out that you're maybe towards the very end of the game, you've got that last burst, that last sprint, and you're really pulling on yourself to get to the ball. That's probably what 10 is at. Okay. So most of the time we're going to be somewhere in the middle. But actually this is a scale, or this is I suppose a perceived scale that, you know, can work with players all across the pathway, whether they're really young. Equally, you know, this is something that as a player you can make a note of this yourself. You can do this really easy on your phone. You could, as a coach, you know, we talked a little bit earlier around maybe asking the players themselves, and that will give you a bit of an idea. Actually, as a coach, you might think that a session's really, really difficult, and the players might find it easier. Equally, as a coach, you might not understand that the players have had if they're school age players, they might have had a game that day and they mightn't have told you, and then they come to training and it's something that you think's perceived to be quite easy, and they could be ranking it actually up around the 9. So Sarah, just to bring you in on that stage, was there anything else that you had? I know we kind of talked around this concept a bit earlier.
Yeah, I think like from an RPE point of view, it's important like that we don't judge ourselves or kind of judge players. Sometimes like as a player, you know, sometimes you go out and you think, oh my God, that session was so hard. Why was it so hard? You know, I really struggled with that. And there can be so many other factors that affect that training load so that we can just turn around and go, oh, I'm so fit. I wasn't able for that. You know, my friend beside me ran through it so easy and she had no problems with it. Why was it so hard for me? And I think, you know, that can be different for everybody. So, you know, maybe we were on our period and so, you know, that can be a factor. Like, had we a lot going on at work? Did we not sleep well last night? All those sort of things can have a huge effect on like our own personal, like our rate of perceived exertion. So I think it's important like that. Or as a coach, if you see a player and you go, you know, she actually like ran faster last week. Why isn't she running as fast this week? You know, or if you were to ask your players after a session, you know, like what's your RPE this week? Kind of explain to them at the beginning, you know, how the scale works, and then maybe ask them, and you get a good idea of where your players are at or what they're getting out of a session. Like if you're going to keep doing a session and your players RPE is down at like 2, 3, you know, 4 maybe, then you know there's no harm in making it a little bit harder, kind of increasing the intensity. Or if it's up really hard for everybody, then going, okay, gosh, I didn't think that was that hard, let's pull it back a little bit. So it's a really good tool for a coach to be able to use. Like you can chat to your players, see how they find it, opposed to just turning around and going, okay, how do we all get on? And they're all going, good, you know. We can chat a bit more about like actually in real life what did that look like for each of us. And then again, not to kind of judge some players. If you turn around, they might have had, you know, they weren't great in a session, like they might have a lot of other things going on and they're not managing that as well, so they might be find a session a lot harder than, you know, they usually would, let's say.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think as well, you know, whether it's as players or coaches, you know, if we think about this, there, you know, we always want to do more. Like, you know, if we get, say, for example, you're down the pitch and all of a sudden you get that extra half an hour of pitch time, you know, generally we'll take it. Or as a player, if it's, you know, people are like, oh, we're going to do a couple of runs or we're going to do a bit more ball work, you know, you'll generally do it. But if we think about the frequency and the duration of the training, actually, increasing that by quite a bit over, like if we do an extra half an hour, that can affect then this rate of perceived exertion. So something that's maybe gone from being like an easy or moderate session can actually go to maybe being something that's a little bit more tough. because of that change of frequency over a period of time. So I think the scale here, this is something that's used quite a lot across, I suppose, multiple sports. And it's a really, really easy thing, and most, like, any player can, as I say, if you have like, whether it's a notebook, even if it's notes in your app that you just write down, actually trained trained Monday, did 1 hour Gaelic session, was perfect, found it about a 4. Like, that's something that can be done in 20 seconds, really easy to measure and really easy to, I suppose, produce accountability there. In terms then of this workload ratio, so I want to give you an example that factors in the RPE. And this is to, I suppose, bring, like, as I said, the duration is one aspect, but the intensity and the impact on the player is probably the more important aspect. So if we look here, what we see is that, and this is just a general example, and I have a Gaelic one now in a second, but if we had maybe week 1, player returning from injury, they might do 2 jogs at 30 minutes, and they found that the RPE was around a 3. Okay, so we see that their workload then is, you essentially multiply everything together. So you multiply the amount of stuff you did by the length of time that it lasts, and then you multiply it by the RPE. So that gives us a workload of 180. Week 2, then they're back into training sessions. Just do 30 minutes though. But maybe because of the change of direction stuff, maybe they're doing more teamwork, the RPE's gone up to 6. Okay, so what we see here, same duration, they've done 1 hour, they've done it across 2 sessions, but because of the RPE, the actual workload has doubled. Then we see that they have 2 matches, 1 light training session, of an RPE of 20, and then and minutes of 20, and then an RP of 8. Okay, so that workload is coming out at 480. And then the last one, we have 3 light training sessions, 40 minutes of an RP of 4. Okay, so over the course of the month, we add this all up, which comes to 1500, and then we divide it by 4, which brings out the chronic workload rate, or the chronic workload, as 375. Okay, so then if we're looking at the last week within that, we go to divide the 480 by 375, and that comes out just under the kind of ratio that we're looking for of 1.28. Now, if we're dealing with, as a player, I play multiple sports, or equally if I'm a coach dealing with players that play multiple sports, this is maybe something more of a realistic example. Okay, so what we see here is that this player is a Gaelic player, but they also play soccer as well. Okay, so they do 2 Gaelic sessions a week of 1 hour each with an RP of 6. They then do 2 soccer trainings a week, which are longer, but the RP is reduced. Okay, so that's a really heavy week for a player with 4 training sessions. So the RP, or sorry, the workload is 1,620. Okay, the next week then they have a Gaelic match, they have a Gaelic training, and they have 2 soccer trainings. The general amount of time is reduced, and the RP is reduced for most of the training, because they are obviously, the RP is higher than in the match scenario. So overall, the workload is 1,200. Over the next 2 weeks, then we see an overall workload of 1,305 in week 3, and then 1,320 in week 4. So overall, the total month training load is 5,445. Okay, so dividing that then by 4, we see that this figure down here of 1,361.25 is our workload. Okay, across the month, or our average workload across the month. Okay, so based on that, then if we take our last week and divide it by the average, or the chronic workload for the month, we see that the chronic acute to chronic workload ratio is coming in at 0.96. Okay, so that'll be quite good in terms of a maintenance stage. Anything at 1 would essentially mean we're just maintaining where we're at week on week. So that'll be something that, particularly for this player, they're obviously playing a lot of matches, so they're in competition stage. This is probably what we would want to see within this. And how can we actually, like, there are some kind of, I suppose, calculations or useful formulas in order to measure this, but I suppose, what other ways can we measure this? So look, we all see most players, most people now have a fitness tracker or sports watches. These will measure a lot of the metrics for us, okay? In some team scenarios, you might have GPS data, so you might use things such as stat sports. Again, this rate of perceived exertion is really, really useful in terms of measuring the impact of training load. You can keep a personal diary to track sessions per week, and that's definitely something I would recommend. Sometimes as players, it's really easy just to go from one session to one session, and you're always thinking about just the next session or getting through something, or you're thinking, right, I need to get to the game at the weekend. So what am I doing in relation to that? Actually, if you're kind of planning out over the course of the month, especially if you're working across multiple sports or playing multiple sports, we want to be building in, if we're looking at that microcycle stage, we want to be building in, again, time for rest on a regular basis. So if I was looking at a microcycle, which would be a weekly basis, we probably want to be building in a minimum of 1 to 2 rest days. Within that, if it's over the mesocycle, then we probably want to build in a lighter week if possible. That might not always be possible depending on the stage of the season that we're at. So it's really important that we build it in within those mesocycle stages. You wouldn't, or sorry, those microcycle, you wouldn't want to be going week on week on week of playing maybe 6, 7 days a week. You might be able to do that for 1 week, but you're generally not to be doing it or not be able to do it over the course of time. And we haven't really mentioned this so far, but really, really important to listen to your body. And this is probably the most important thing. If, there's a difference between fatigue and soreness or pain. And I think that would be really important to say here. We might perceive something to be easier, but actually we might have a lot of pain within that. And actually, sometimes your body will just need a rest in terms of training load. And equally, sometimes your mind will just need a rest in terms of training load, like if you're consistently playing multiple sports. So it's really, really important that we're not just reliant on biometric data, or measurements. They're great, but they only give us half the story. It's really important as players we listen to our body, and equally as coaches that we listen to our players to somewhat in that degree. Sarah, is there anything else you want to kind of come in with there on that measure and training load piece?
No, I think like you've kind of touched on it all there. And even just kind of tracking it ourselves can be, I think the diary sometimes can be a good one for if we're starting out or if we haven't got like something like a GPS tracker, whether it's like, a Fitbit or something that kind of we have anyway. I think the diary is always a good one, especially as we start to, we move into gym sessions and stuff. It's really important that you're kind of tracking, what weight you lifted this week, so you're able to, match that next week, and it's not something that we're just trying to go, oh God, I haven't a clue what I lifted this week, last week. Oh, sure, I'll start with this and just see how it goes. Or like that, if we're running and doing our own sessions, particularly like if we're trying to do a running session or a gym session outside of a collective session, a personal diary, like whether it's a notebook or your notes app, is a really, really good way to start out. So I think that's a good like beginner thing to take note of.
Yeah, and I think like even as if you're a coach on the session tonight or watching this back, if you are using maybe like a fitness tracker, or sorry, like a player is using a fitness tracker, actually it'd be really like just ask them at the end of the session. Like a lot of players will track that, particularly at senior level in clubs. So, you know, actually just ask them how much did you run there? You might be surprised. You might think actually they ran a lot more, a lot less than I thought that they would at the start. So it will help you as well manage that training load. And then I suppose some kind of tips, just the last part in terms of practically managing this. I think, as we said, keep a record. If you don't know what you're doing or you can't remember what you're doing, it's going to be really, really difficult to manage. Well, you're not going to be measuring it, so you're not going to be managing it effectively. But listen to your body. Remember this concept of the 24-hour athlete. There's loads of things that we can do. Whilst we can't always manage the training load directly as players or coaches, there's lots of other stuff that we can do to help mitigate some of this. So really get some really good recovery, rest, sleep, hydration, nutrition, get those building blocks right for supporting training load. look, we need to talk to people. If we're coaches, and we have athletes that we're particularly aware of, or we have players that we're aware of that are maybe under higher training load stress, we need to probably talk to the coaches or talk to the parents or talk to the players themselves and share those training schedules so we can actually monitor that. And maybe then adapt the training, a little bit to them. So actually, if I have a player as a coach that, or equally, I'm a player, I've I've played a Gaelic match tonight and actually have a soccer training session tomorrow, and they're doing maybe some longer distance work. Actually, I probably have those miles in the bank that other players don't have. So actually, I can maybe focus more on the technical work. And actually, if we have those conversations, we can facilitate that a little bit more. Again, ensure regular rest and recovery periods, both on short-term and long-term basis. So on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, and particularly on a yearly basis. Um, I think this is really important. Remember that, we don't need to be doing everything as well for performance, and it's not just all about training loads. Obviously, that's the focus of the webinar this evening, but um, actually we can have sessions that, we know are going to have very little impact in terms of our training load, but they're actually meeting other motivations in terms of keeping people retained and participating within the sport. So the social involvement, participating, having fun. I think it's really important as well. Training loads often associated with burnout, and whilst burnout isn't just impacted by training load, there is a connection there. So we previously ran a webinar, I think it was back in November, where Dr. Siobhan Woods, who is a former Dublin footballer, I'm sure people will be aware of some of her research, but she delivered a webinar for us around burnout and the impact, and talked a little bit around training load there. So might be a good idea to catch up on that if you have some time. It's available on our YouTube channel. And then be observant for the signs of impact in other aspects of life. So, if somebody is maybe under more pressure at school, if they're under more pressure at work, if they're just have more stuff going on in their life, maybe more so than usual, that might impact that, particularly that aspect of RPE. Okay. It might also impact that 24-hour athlete concept. So whilst the training load that you might see from that external training load aspect might increase, there's other intrinsic factors that might actually increase the impact of that. So I think that is pretty much it. We're going to go to questions shortly, but Sarah, is there anything that you want to touch upon there just before we go into questions?
No, I think you've hit it all there, Eilish. Just kind of the importance of listening to your own body, or if it's from a coach's point of view, to try and be observant and be conscious of of your players, and sometimes they mightn't tell you what's going on, or tell you that they're whether they're struggling at school, or that they have different things going on. So sometimes we need to ask, kind of like probe a little bit. So it could be, how's school going, or has anybody any exams this week, or that sort of thing, just to factor in what might be going on in people's life outside of football, and how it can affect their football or their sport. So just from a coaching point of view. But I think we've pretty much hit it all there.
Perfect.
You see a question popping up there in
Yeah,
the section.
let's see that. Guys, I think Sarah's going to come to that question shortly, but if anybody else has any other questions, just write them there in the Q&A or the chat function, and we'll get to those now.
Yeah, so we might just go through this one for this one question in there that we can have a chat about, and if anyone else like I just said, just wants to, if they have anything else, just to add it in. But so Keith said, when the player is involved in two sports with very different seasons, it can mean that the competitive phase of one sport collides with the pre-season phase of the other. This can create almost a year-round competition phase. So for younger players, like their early teens, this might not be much of a risk. But what age do you think this type of pattern might become a concern? So I think it can vary. I think if it's, I know as you get older, like it can be a bigger issue. But I do think, like a play, like like we spoke about, a player has to listen to their own body, and sometimes it's not healthy to go straight into the competitive phase of another sport. And if it's a case that we could take, it could be a shortened rest period, but if still that that player could take a rest period between the two phases, it definitely would be ideal. So you'd be hoping that if somebody was moving from one competitive phase straight into another, that they'd be able to take some level of time off, like we see with Gaelic footballers, if they're playing their club, if they're playing with their club and their club get to a high level, then by the time the club has kind of finished at an All Ireland series, their county might be back to league games already. But some players won't take that time, but it can be useful that they miss the first couple of league games or that kind of thing to take a break, and that mightn't be an option for everybody all the time, but that would probably be an ideal scenario. Eilish, do you want to add anything to that then as well?
Yeah, I think just on that piece around what age does this type of pattern might become a concern. Like I think generally across all sports, we'll see it that sports generally tend to move into that more competitive structure as players go into actually that early teen stage. If we think about it from a game scenario, players obviously come from go games and then they go into kind of the more traditional competition-based structure. Now, obviously, there are aspects of that are less formalized or less traditional in terms of the competition structure, but I do think it's once players start to go into that more traditional structure, which does happen from early teens level. And Keith, I'm just going to nearly read between the lines here in terms of the way that that's phrased, but I'm going to guess that these are maybe particularly more talented players potentially. If they're going from, what you'll find is that it's maybe players that particularly from like a lady sport aspect, we tend to find it's the same players that are playing multiple sports then, because one coach is looking for them, the other coach is looking for them. They're playing on maybe an under 14 team, they're also on the under 16 team. And that's where that kind of aspect of managing the training though can be really, really tricky. So yeah, I think that can be a concern from probably that early teenager phase. I think if it's not managed though, what you'll tend to find is, and I would really advise, like Siobhan talks about this a lot within her webinar on burnout, there are aspects where like players like are ultimately people, we're not machines, so we can't just keep going and going and going. They will probably, there will be a physiological issue or a physical issue at some point, which can present itself in exhaustion, tiredness, injury. But equally, even if we think about it from a mental aspect and a psychological aspect, for a player to keep motivated, and we all want to play, but it's very difficult to stay at that kind of peak level of performance, both mentally and physically for any space of time. So I think that starts to come to fruition in the early teens, but that's probably where you then see, maybe a higher level of burnout as players start to go maybe towards their later teens would probably be what I would see in practice a little bit more.
I do think on that as well, if it's coming from a coaching point of view, or particularly if a player is playing across different age groups, that a huge responsibility can fall on the coaches to kind of take a bit of that pressure off the child, so whether it's an under 14 player that's playing up to the under 16s, can the under 16 manager talk to the under 14, see is it okay if they miss an under 14 training session because they've got an under 16 game, or that sort of way. And like that comes with building, really, as a coach, it comes with building relationships across sports sometimes, and particularly across age groups if it's in the one club, or if you're within one club and one sport. But even to be able to say, like, with your, if you have a kid that's playing soccer and playing Gaelic football, can you as a Gaelic football coach say to a soccer coach, if she's going to miss a Gaelic football session to play a soccer game for you, so is it okay if she misses your soccer session, training session to play a Gaelic football game or that? And it means that, the player isn't going then to training going, oh no, I won't, everyone's going to be mad at me because I'm not training. Whereas if you take that pressure off them as a coach, it can help a lot as well. So just for kind of a practical point of view, if we can do that, it can make a big difference.
Yeah, and I think there's a perception, actually, other players or sorry, other coaches might not be willing to, work with that, and you might find actually, oh well, I'm letting them miss Gaelic, but then the soccer coach isn't letting them miss soccer. So why am I letting them miss Gaelic? And like the player's just caught in a vicious cycle. But what you'll find then is actually the player will have built up more trust with the coach that actually understands them. And particularly, at that teenage age, I think that the importance of that trust in terms of the relationship with the player is absolutely crucial and integral to that. So if the player doesn't have that, they're not going to come to you with any other issues, and equally they're probably just more likely to drop out then in general anyway. We see that a lot from teenage players. So I think that would be really, really important. Um, I can't see any other questions there at the moment. So guys, we'll probably stay online for another couple of minutes, but please feel free to write in any questions. And we'll kind of hang on here for a little minute if anybody has anything, but I will stop the recording there.